Amen. So, greetings again. Over this week, from Monday through to Friday, I will be. By the way, we're translating, so I'll try to be careful to moderate my speech. Over this week, from Monday through to Friday, I will be sharing a series entitled Abortion, the History and the Data. Abortion, the History and the Data. And I'll just ask the translators if I'm speaking too quick. Feel free to send me a direct message in the Zoom, and but I will try to be careful to give you enough time. And in this series, I'll be sharing. I'll ask that there be no interruptions, that you all keep your mics muted. If you want to contribute anything, please do so through the chat function. But beyond that, I'll just ask that we keep our mics muted because there is a lot of material for us to get through. And with translation, it would, we need all the time. We need all the time that we have to be able to get through the material. Okay, so abortion, the history and the data. I want to speak briefly to the context of this study, why I'm here sharing it with us at this time. As Elder Tess was covering just this last weekend, actually, on March 19th, she presented a message which identified that sexism is the issue. However we frame that, gender equality, sexism, that is the test for this dispensation. There are other issues that are current. Racism is a current issue, and there are other current issues, but the testing issue, in our history is that of sexism. And that subject of sexism, considered more broadly, encompasses the issue of the LGBTQ community, right? So sexism and equality are the themes that we are grappling with. And they're the themes that we need to understand. And in my study of the subject, as I've sought to understand, okay, I've been asked to slow down. In my study of the subject of equality, okay, sorry, technical issue. I've been asked to join one of the translation channels that will allow me to better monitor. Okay, so in my study of the subject over the last few months, I've realized that the issue of reproductive rights that you really cannot separate the issue of reproductive rights from a woman's ability to stand on a level playing field with men. Right, for women to be able to, navigate through life and reach a position of equality, the question of reproductive rights is closely linked to that. And when you come to the question of reproductive rights, you start to look at the issues of contraception and also abortion, right? And as I began to look at the subject of abortion, I realized something that I think most of us will realize. Which is that many of us, our view of the subject maybe it has changed since the midnight cry. But if we look at the subject of abortion and how we view it, our perspective is generally taken from the right. From conservatives. And what is the conservative view of abortion? It's that it's a sin, that it's a moral wrong. It's viewed in a very black and white moralistic fashion. Right? And for many of us, even though the light of the two streams has come to us, our perspective on that subject hasn't changed. So I began to wonder, we are saying that the left has the correct perspective on the testing issues, broadly speaking. Of course, we know it's more nuanced than that, right? But broadly speaking. Yet it seems strange that on this issue, there really hasn't been any reflection on it, since there really hasn't been any reflection on it since this light came in. Right. So I started looking at this subject. I started looking at the history of the subject. Looking at some of the tools of methodology that have been open to us. We understand that if you want to understand a subject, you cannot view it in a vacuum. Right? You cannot view it in a snapshot in time where you currently stand. You have to understand its context. You have to trace its development from its beginning to the present. You have to thread the needle through. And it's only as you do that that you can come to a right perspective on the issue in the present. And we have seen what happens when you don't do that. You develop an incorrect perspective. and you'll come to view the good guys as bad and the bad guys as good. Right. So, of course, this is a sensitive subject. And it's not my purpose to answer in black and white terms whether it's right or wrong. Right? Whether it's morally okay for a woman to have an abortion or whether it isn't. But I think we have the tools of methodology now to be able to frame more nuanced perspectives on the subject. And again, it's an important subject because it touches on women's equality in society. And women's ability to achieve equality in society. And it's important to us in this movement, not only because we have to interact with society and present them with right perspectives on issues, present them with a right representation of God's character. It's important from that perspective. But it's also important because even some women in this movement have been confronted with this issue personally. Right? So it becomes a very important subject to understand. So I call this study the history and the data. Because these are the two perspectives that I want to take on with the subject. Right, we want to look at the history. We want to thread through the history of the anti-choice movement in the United States. So that those of us who have a decidedly anti-choice position we can begin to reflect on our position through the lens of the history that has brought us to this point. Right, and you can find this history in different places. But there's one book that really nailed it down. And gives the subject a most comprehensive treatment. And it's a book called The Lie That Binds. I'm going to show you an image of it. Okay, so that's The Lie That Binds by Elise Hogue. All right, so this book gives the history of how abortion was settled upon. right? How abortion was chosen by the, yeah, how it was chosen by the architects of the radical right. Or the architects of the religious right as a tool to advance their religious and political agenda. Right? The rise of the modern anti-choice movement is inextricably linked to the rise of the religious right. And this book lays it out so powerfully. If you want to do a deep dive on this subject, if you want to understand this subject in as much detail as possible, then I would really recommend this book. Okay. Okay. So I'll just make a note about the author. Elise Hogue, she's an American progressive activist. Who served as president of the NARAL. NARAL. NARAL, which is the National Association for the Repeal of Abortion Laws. And that is it's a reproductive rights lobbying and advocacy organization. All right. So this book lays out the history and the history of the anti-choice movement. But this series is called The History and the Data. Right. Because we're not only going to be looking at the history of the anti-choice movement, we're going to be looking at at scientific data, which answers questions about abortion, which addresses, which looks at why women seek abortions, as well as what happens when women are denied abortions. Right. So it's a comparative study. Right. You have women seeking abortions. What happens when those women receive those abortions? What happens to their families? What happens to, well, first and foremost, what happens to them? Right? Their future, their prospects for their futures. their economic independence, their health, what happens to the children that they already have, what happens to the children they are yet to have. Right? What happens when these women receive abortions, as opposed to what happens when they're denied those abortions. Now, this comparative study is the subject of a second book. And I will share it with you. There we go. Right, I hope we see that. The Turnaway Study by Diana Green Foster. Now, this book answers, I'll just read a note about it quickly. Right, the Turnaway Study it's a groundbreaking study. Right, which studied over 1,000 women over 10 years. To seek to add concrete scientific data. Or I should say statistical data. To give understanding as to, what are the outcomes. And why this book is important is because the subject of abortion and the women who find themselves in positions where they're having to seek one, there are many assumptions that we tend to have. Right? Assumptions about the women's motives. Also assumptions about whether or not abortion is ultimately harmful to women. And this study really seeks to address and clarify some of those assumptions. Okay, so we're going to begin with The Lie That Binds. I'm going to be drawing heavily from that book. Right, we're going to look at the history first. And it's on the history where we're going to spend most of our time this week. Okay, so what is the lie that binds? What is the lie that is referenced in the title? Sorry about that, I had to close the door. What is the lie referenced in the title? It's the idea that the religious right is motivated. The lie is the idea that the religious right is motivated by a concern for the lives of unborn children. Right, that is the lie. What are they really motivated by? What is their real concern? Right. Their push to ban abortion is really about maintaining a patriarchal, white, male-led social order. Right? And this is the lie the book is exposing. Right? I'm going to read from the prologue of the book. It makes a nice introductory note. Okay. And I'll just paraphrase for translation. So it makes the point that Trump's presidency is commonly described as a backlash. A backlash by white voters against a changing society. Right? And she says that's correct. But that's only a snapshot of this moment in time. Right? The history laid out in this book paints a picture of a small group of radical right leaders who almost a century ago saw movements for freedom and equality as an existential threat to their power. As a threat to their social, economic, and political power. And these leaders of the radical right used fear as a strategy to maintain control. Through carefully constructed and well-funded campaigns. Right? And the book, as it lays out this history, it makes the observation that they've been successful. And how they've managed to achieve this success is through the use of disinformation, and placing a moral mantle, on issues, and forcing a binary viewpoint. Right? Forcing a black and white framing on issues that are really much more complex than that. Right. She makes the point that any individual decision to terminate a pregnancy factors in innumerable considerations. Job status and prospects, financial savings, existing family issues, individual faith, current health and well-being, partnership status, right? Just to name a few. A million calculations go into making the best decisions for oneself. And for those in their lives. Right? But the radical right have succeeded by, forcing a binary viewpoint on these very complex issues. Right. So this book lays out that I'll say it that way. The machinery that they constructed to turn this issue into the really powerful weapon that it has become for them. Right. So as she begins to lay out this history, beginning on page 12, she begins with a name that should be familiar to all of us now. And she begins with the sentence, Paul Weyrich was frustrated. Right? Paul Weyrich, one of the architects of the religious right as we currently see it today. Right? He spent a good part of the 1970s and 1980s building the infrastructure that we recognize today as the power centers of the modern conservative movement. These include organizations that we should become familiar with if we're not already. Organizations like the Council for National Policy, the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, and the Heritage Foundation. Right? All these organizations sprang up from Weyrich's ability to form alliances. To advance his cause. She makes the point that he even helped coin the term moral majority. Which he partnered with Jerry Falwell to do. Right, so the history of the modern anti-choice movement is really inextricably linked to the rise of the religious right. And we cannot have a right understanding of this subject without recognizing that fact. Okay, so she goes on to speak of a conference that Weyrich attended in 1990. It was a men's-only conference, a men-only conference, right, called the Ethics and Public Policy Conference. And he was speaking to the, the foot soldiers, shall we say, the political activists of the conservative movement. Yeah. And Weyrich speaking at this conference, he really berated them. He really chastised them. Okay, he really he rebuked them. Speaking at this conference, he rebuked the attendees. That they knew little about the origins of their own movement. Or what it had taken to build the radical right into the political powerhouse it had become. And his rebuke to them was that they had spent so much time repeating the myth, repeating the lie, that their movement originated from backlash to Roe versus Wade. Roe versus Wade was the 1973 Supreme Court decision. Which legalized abortion. And even today, in various articles, even on the news, you'll find that repeated. Right, that Roe versus Wade was what galvanized the religious right. And here he is chastising them, saying that was not the issue. He said they had repeated the lie so much they'd come to believe it themselves. And they had lost sight of the true foundation of their movement. Right, and one of the attendees, a historian, he was so startled by this that he came to Weyrich afterwards to ask him to repeat himself. To say, did I hear you correctly? Was that really what you meant? And Weyrich doubled down. Right? He doubled down, stating that the purpose of the movement that we see today heavily organized around the subject of abortion right, or should I say heavily organized around abortion politics, that the original purpose of this movement was to preserve a system where social order and status were rigid. . and grounded in the fundamental belief that God placed white male Christians in charge. Right? All of this based on an ideology called dominionism. Right. So that's out of the horse's mouth. The story of the religious right did not begin with Roe versus Wade. Where did it begin? And this is something that has been covered also, in the presentations that have been opened up to us. It began almost 20 years earlier, in 1954. With Brown versus Board of Education. Right, so as I have a chart here that I will share with you. So as we begin this, to thread this history through, we must begin in 1954 with the Brown versus Board of Education decision. Okay, I'll say for those who may want that chart, it will be shared to the forum. And so don't worry about that. All right, so what was Brown versus Board of Education? Right, it was the Supreme Court decision which abolished segregation in public schools. Right, it abolished it on the grounds that it was unconstitutional. And following this court decision, religious conservatives opened segregation academies. These were their own private schools, right? Only for their children. Right? Or say only for white children. Right. So following Brown versus Board of Education, that decision angered religious conservatives. And their way around it was to open their own schools, which continued segregation. Prominent in the history that we've covered is Bob Jones University. And Liberty University, which was opened by Jerry Falwell. Right, and religious freedom was the argument that they presented. To shield the racist motives, what they're doing, what they were doing. Okay, so in 1954, you have Brown versus Board of Education. Then in 1968, a group of Black parents saw what was going on. That while segregation was unconstitutional, in practice, it was still continuing through these private schools. So they brought a case against these segregation academies. In a 1968 court case called Green versus Connolly. Right, and this case resulted in Richard Nixon beginning interventions against the tax-exempt status of these segregation academies. Right, on the grounds that they practiced de facto segregation. Right, and it was this move that outraged the religious right. And led them to begin to mobilize politically. And of course, we know Jerry Falwell was one of the leaders of this mobilization. Right, as you thread through this history, you'll see that at the time the religious right was becoming politically activated. Abortion was not part of their agenda. Right. So the few points, this is laid out on pages 16 to 19 of the book. And it makes the point that Falwell himself didn't mention the word abortion in a sermon until 1978. Right? Falwell didn't mention abortion in a sermon until 5 full years after Roe versus Wade. Right? It then cites others. It quotes W.A. Criswell, who was a president of the Southern Baptist Convention. And he supported Roe versus Wade. And his reasoning was as follows. He says, I have always felt that it was only after a child was born and had a life separate from its mother that it became an individual person. And it has always therefore seemed to me that what is best for the mother and for the future should be allowed. right? This was a former president of the Southern Baptist Convention shortly after the decision was passed in Roe versus Wade. In 1971, the Southern Baptist Convention passed a resolution that encouraged its followers to work for legislation to legalize abortion. And they outlined a whole range of scenarios where they believed abortion would be right and good. And it makes the point that in 1969, Republicans actually led Democrats by 10%. In their support for legalized abortion. And another poll found that in 1972, 68% of Republicans believed abortion to be a private matter between a woman and a doctor. Right. So so someone is asking, what's the name of this book, Joao Pedro? It's The Lie That Binds. The Lie That Binds by Rousseau. So when you survey the landscape of the the political opinions of the churches in the 60s and 70s, apart from a minority of conservative Catholics, right? The attitude of the evangelical churches towards abortion was really, where it wasn't indifference, it was actually support. Right? It's not until much later that we see this shift taking place. So the question we need to ask is, what changed? Right? As we thread through this history, what changed? And I'll state it simply. What changed was this religious movement built around politicizing the issue of race, right? It began to lose steam, right? Their fight to preserve segregation became less popular. The civil rights movement was active at the time. Societal opinions were shifting. And open appeals to racism were becoming less popular. So they began to look for new issues to keep their base engaged. And to try to influence the broader society. Right, so they went for a fishing expedition. And while on this expedition, they came across a woman by the name of Phyllis Schlafly. Phyllis Schlafly. So when you look at the rise of the religious right, they are individuals that figure prominently in that history. You know, and Phyllis Schlafly is one of them. I believe she's the subject. I think there's some documentaries on her, and I think there was even a TV series on her recently. A biographical sort of thing. I say that only to point out that she is recognized for the impact that she had. All right, so who was Phyllis Schlafly? I'll come to a quote from page 26 of the book. Okay, so this passage on page 26. Speaking of Phyllis Schlafly, it says she was a long-time Republican political activist. And she aspired to be a leader on national security. And she had spent a lot of time in the 1950s agitating against communism. Because that's what she believed was the primary threat to the United States. She wrote a book in 1964 called A Choice, Not an Echo. And what she did in this book, she condemned the leaders of the GOP. She blamed them for undermining far-right populism. And drawing the party to a moderate position. Right, and it's not in this note, but Phyllis Schlafly endorsed Trump during his first campaign. Right, and she said he was what they had been fighting for all this time. That's what she said. Right, a radical right-wing populist. And she died shortly after that. But I make that point to say, you can begin to see the populist, you can trace the populist impulse in the Republican Party way before Trump. You could trace the Republican impulse in the Republican Party to way before Trump. So Schlafly, she desperately wanted to find a foothold in the Republican Party. She was an elected delegate to every Republican National Convention from 1952 onward. But she lost elections for both a congressional seat and for the role of president of the National Federation of Republican Women. Right. So it's around about this time. I think this is the 1970s. There was another development that was taking place, which was the move to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. Right, the Equal Rights Amendment also referred to as the ERA. It was a constitutional amendment that was first proposed in 1923. And it passed by Congress in 1972. And it sought to guarantee equal rights for all American citizens, regardless of sex, and it sought to do this by ending the legal distinction between men and women ending the legal distinction between men and women. In matters of divorce, property, employment, and other issues. This is not a point made in the document, made in the book. A New York Times article states that as much as 80% of Americans believe that women and men are already explicitly guaranteed equal rights by the Constitution. But it currently only does so on the right to vote. And the Equal Rights Amendment was designed to fix that, to remedy that omission. So you have this landscape, if you can picture the landscape. You have the architects of the religious right. They're seeing they're losing momentum. And they're looking for new issues to keep their movement active. Then you have this maverick politician, Phyllis Schlafly, highly ambitious, also looking for a way to elevate herself in the ranks of power. Then you also have this Equal Rights Amendment that is being passed and is being agitated and being promoted. So as Schlafly saw this, she made an observation. She saw that her counterparts in the Republican Party were being shaken by the changes that were taking place in society. They were concerned that the sexual revolution of the 1960s would be devastating to American society. And she picked up the anxieties about feminism. That feminism would undo their privileged place in society. Right. So she read the currents that were at play at that time. And she seized upon the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, as a symbol of as a symbol of the threat to society, as a symbol of all that was going wrong. As the Equal Rights Amendment went to the states for ratification, she saw that the threats to gender norms were now a living reality. And as she made a shift from her sort of anti-communist focus as a shift to attacking the Equal Rights Amendment, she found that, after years of being sidelined, after years of being, I don't want to say ignored, after years of being, or if I will say, after years of being put to the side, she became highly sought after right, by right-leaning GOP leaders. As a woman willing to lead the crusade against women's rights. She launched a campaign in 1972 called Stop ERA. And STOP stood for Stop Taking Our Privileges. And she founded a newsletter to communicate nationwide with women across America. Women who saw the ERA as a threat to their way of life. And a lot of women were quick to embrace her message. That the ERA was dangerous, that it would erase legal differences between men and women, that women could be conscripted and then forced to go to war, that women would no longer get preferential child custody in divorce cases, that their right to spousal support in the event of a divorce would be threatened. And, as far as to say, it would lead to homosexual marriage and genderless public toilets. Right. So she framed these things as privileges. That would be threatened or taken away if the ERA were to pass. And she activated a grassroots of zealous zealous women who took up this cause. Now, if you look at the women who supported the Stop ERA movement, they were overwhelmingly white, church-going, and from rural and suburban middle and upper class. Right? So by definition, they had privileges to lose. Right? Relative to minorities, to women of color, to gay women, to single mothers. Right? These women held a position of privilege relative to these other people. Right? And they felt that they had privileges to lose. Right? So Schlafly's campaign was effective. The ERA was set to pass. over 30 states quickly ratified it. But as the Stop ERA movement began to work, right, the progress slowed down. And by the time the 1979 deadline for ratification came, the ERA was short of 3 states to pass. It was short of 3 states to become a constitutional amendment. Right, so her campaign was effective. And Paul Weyrich and Jerry Falwell were watching this happen. They were watching her work. And they saw in her campaign a proof of concept. What they saw was that their constituents, white religious conservatives, could be activated by issues more than just race or white supremacy. They became convinced that at that time, when civil rights was making progress, and openly racist appeals were losing their appeal. Openly racist appeals were losing their power. They determined to tone down on their racism, to draw back on that a bit. And persuade more Americans to fear the impact of giving freedom and power to women. So we're coming to the close of our time. I know it's been a lot of history, but I hope you've been able to follow. Right. But in any case, to summarize, Paul Weyrich and Jerry Falwell and other leaders of the religious right, were looking for new issues to activate their base. They keenly observed what was taking place with the Equal Rights Amendment and Phyllis Schlafly's successful campaign against it. Right? They saw that their base could be activated by more than race. And it's shortly after that in 1978, I believe, that a conference call takes place where, as these architects of the religious right were strategizing, with the backdrop of what they had seen happen with the ERA. That someone in that conference call said, "What about abortion?" And that conference call, it's if we may call it, that conference call is a turning point. In terms of the political strategy of the religious right. So we're going to talk more about that history of that shift in our next study. And then we'll just continue to thread through that history till we hopefully come to the present. Okay, so this is the first one. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. Hope you'll be here tomorrow, same time. I'll ask that we close with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, Lord, we thank you for the ground we've been able to cover. Help us in the time that we have to touch on all the points that we need to reach. Give us the context and the perspective of this issue. And the understanding of its history that will allow us to rightly understand it today and rightly treat the people who are confronted with this situation today. Please bless us and keep us where we are. For we ask it in Jesus' name.